So Onno, tell me a bit about yourself and your journey to where you are today with the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat.
Well, I'm Dutch, and being Dutch, I developed a love of mountains very soon because we like to have what we don't have in our country. So my parents took me trekking in Austria when I was 6 years old, and then to Switzerland for many, many years. And I eventually joined the Foreign Service, despite not being generally known as a great diplomat now. I did that because I learned that the Foreign Service in the Netherlands actually worked on development. And I thought at the time, in the 1980s, that Europe didn't require so much and it would be better to work elsewhere. But that was actually a mistake with hindsight. But at the time it looked like Europe was heading in the right direction. The Berlin Wall was slowly coming down, so I wanted to do something else. Foreign Service sent me to Washington. The Berlin Wall actually did come down, so the World Bank was looking for people who wanted to work on the development of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. As a European economist growing up exactly the entire time of the Berlin Wall, because that's my birth year, I thought it was a fascinating challenge. So I joined the World Bank, worked in the former Soviet Union, worked in the Balkans after the wars, and then had the time of my life working in Africa. First in Eastern and Southern Africa, very much AKDN core territory. Then was posted in Kinshasa and Abuja, and eventually had, I think, the tremendous honor of being country director for India for the World Bank, which is a hallowed program in the institution. After that, I got a call from a headhunter, and the headhunter said, His Highness the Aga Khan is setting up a new agency. It will focus on the quality of life of the people living in the high mountains of the Himalayas, Karakoram and Pamir Mountains, and it will be based in Geneva. And I said, hold on, I actually have a house in Chambéry, which is right outside of Geneva, and as a child my father brought me here and I always thought it was a nice place. But there was this mountain thing, right? So I was like, okay. World Bank people always say no to headhunters. I said, well, this might be interesting. And he said, could you be in Geneva for an interview next week? I said, you send me a ticket, I go. 16 interviews later, I had the honor of meeting His Highness for the final interview. And that's how I came to the AKDN.
Amazing. What a journey. Thank you for telling us all of that. And you've given me a bit of a brief in terms of what the headhunter asked you or told you about the role. But I'm just going to push you a bit on that. So when I get home today, my 5-year-old is going to ask me who I met. How should I explain to her your role and the agency? Well,
I have a 5-year-old also, and I'll have to test what I tell you because I actually haven't told her. She just thinks I'm the boss somewhere, right? But what I would tell your girl, and I'll tell mine also, is that they're both born in the UK and Switzerland, respectively, yeah. And obviously they live in systems, they're different, but they have great opportunity where they are. If they do what they're supposed to do, they have every opportunity they choose to have. What you should tell her is that I'm working with a team in South and Central Asia and the Middle East that tries to work so that people live in a habitat, a space where they live, that is conducive so that the girls who get born in those places, in the high mountains of Pakistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, in the coastal areas of India, in Syria, they have the same opportunity. And that requires a lot of work because there's lots that stands in the way and opportunities are not yet equal. And that's what we're trying to do.
Amazing. Yeah, I like that way of describing it. I'll try it. I'll let you know how it goes. So the agency for Habitat is a relatively young agency. I think it was established in 2016.
Yeah, actually just a year before I came, but then of course when they found a general manager, it kind of like took off if it did.
Yeah. So can you tell us the story of why Hazur Imam chose to establish the agency?
Yeah, well, there's actually quite a bit of quotation from His Highness about that. And the first thing that is important to realize that he started talking about this from 1985, a very long time. This has been really a long time in the making. And that's Partly because the AKDN had agencies that were focusing on the areas where the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat, we call it AKA. It's a great name, by the way, because in the local language in the mountains it means big brother, so nobody can mistake it. So what we focus on, the network was already working on. There's two aspects there. The work of focus and DRMI, Disaster Risk Management Initiative, worked on the fact that natural hazard is a problem in particularly mountainous areas, and communities need to be prepared to deal with that. And you also need to have the science to have the facts to help communities deal with that. And then there was the Aga Khan Planning and Building Services, which is essentially an engineering agency which works on something that His Highness talked about forever, which is the structural integrity of built environment and buildings, because they can be so dangerous if they're not well built. Now, as time progresses, His Highness observed, along with us, but he observed it earlier than most of us, as tends to be the case. He observed that the risks that were there were actually getting worse. And as he reflected on it, and a very important moment was the Atabat Lake disaster in Hunza in northern Pakistan in 2010, he realized that there were two factors driving the fact that more people were victims of disaster than before. One was what he at the time started referring to as global warming, which now we call climate change. And the other is man-made pressures, population movements, densification. Land in mountains is scarce, and so is land in cities. So if you've got more people, people tend to live in more dangerous places. So he started talking about it. In the end, he realized that these risks, particularly the natural hazard risk, which is very directly linked to climate change, would never get better again. They would only get worse. And therefore, he realized that in order to build that quality of life that I want you to tell your daughter about for the children in those communities, you need to be more ambitious in what you pursue in terms of risk management, in terms of preparedness, but also not just aim at people surviving, but actually people, we like to say thriving because it's a good wordplay, but like doing well despite the risk. And he realized that to do that, you needed synergy between the topics that I mentioned, as well as between the country units. And therefore, because the previous agencies were like distinct country units, there wasn't like a head agency with an intellectual capacity to back it up. That's why he created AKA, and that's the mission that we have. It's both beautiful and visionary, allowing people to live a better life despite the moving threat of climate change. It's really a challenge of this day and age, highly, highly relevant for the generation of our children, because climate change has already happened. It's not in the future. It's also daunting, of course, because it's very difficult.
So it sounds like a big part of the agency's role is coordinating and working with other parts of the network. Can you share a little bit more about how you work together and how AKA relates to the other agencies and also to Focus?
So that's an excellent question, and the other agencies wouldn't necessarily say that AKA is the one coordinating, but AKA does play a role that is in support of other agencies in various aspects. So first, on the Focus thing, we've inherited Focus's programs in South and Central Asia, 25 years of history of mobilizing communities, developing a methodology that is internationally recognized as a very good practice. Then there is the more hard-nosed and engineering aspect. One of the things that His Highness always really insisted on was the need to build safely. And I talked earlier about structural integrity of buildings, but there's another aspect, which is the location of the building. The building has to be in a location that is as safe as it can possibly be. No location is 100% safe, but there's a huge difference to where you build. So Focus in the past, and now AKA, has the mandate of supporting any of the other agencies in the network when they do construction in assessing the hazards of the local site, because we have developed the technical capability to do so and declare whether it's in a red zone, which is like really dangerous, in a yellow zone or a green zone, and we're supposed to build only in green zones. In yellow zones you can do things, but you cannot have structures that require permanent occupancy, because obviously not safe.
And can I ask what time horizon you're looking at that with? So safe for what period?
So this is really an excellent question. Traditionally, we had developed a methodology, we actually focus, to assess the site for the immediate risks that are there, things like avalanches, landslides, and localized floods. We've then worked to include things like monitoring of glaciers that might cause what we call remote risks, because glaciers are very risky, particularly now that they're melting because of climate change. They can cause what they call glacier lake outburst floods, which are epic and very dangerous events. So we've expanded what we look at, but we're now actually embarking on a study, and I'm kind of proud to say we're doing that with technical collaboration with NASA, to assess for our geographies what we think the risks will be 30 years from now and 50 years from now, because we're actually now thinking, because of climate change, about the long-term viability of the habitat and of course the specific location. We're not there yet, but we're working on it. We work a lot with AKF on programs that they raise funds for on our behalf, and that's of course a very productive and important relationship to us. And then from time to time, we do joint programming. For instance, when we do water supply, there's often a health intervention, or there might be irrigation interventions, which would bring AKHS or AKRSP, for example. We do these things together. And COVID made us go to the next level, because that was an all hands on deck solution. So I think we're still exploring how much we can collaborate. We're looking, for instance, right now as to how we can be constructive in a very difficult situation in Tajikistan, in Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast, and how we can all pull together and work together. So I think there's definitely a tendency towards even more collaboration in the AKDN.
Yeah, thank you. And Onno, you've mentioned climate change a few times so far in our conversation. Can you share us a little bit more about how that's affecting the work of AKA? You know, how are we helping communities to respond to climate change?
Right. That's actually my favorite question, because when AKA was created, the word climate change was nowhere in the mandate. And in fact, the AKDN hadn't at that time assumed a clear identity and goal around climate change. In 2019, I believe it was, we had a very important meeting of the AKDN committee where a proposal was made to make climate change a core identity of the AKDN and to create an Environment and Climate Change Committee. And His Highness approved that, in fact asked for more than was proposed, said this is really the time to go for this, and asked Prince Rahim to lead the Environment and Climate Change Committee. It's a committee that sets the overall goal. Now, when we were thinking in AKA about our mandate, this quality of life for people who are under threat, we realized that in fact what we are is an agency that works on adaptation to climate change, right at the front lines of climate change, because the mountains and of course the coast are the two front lines. The mountains are where the glaciers are, where there's a direct threat. It's like the North Pole and the South Pole, except no polar bears or penguins, actual people living there. So it's really actually much more challenging in that sense. And then the coast, we all know, there's been much more advocacy around it. But for us, the seminal image became that, particularly for the highly strategic mountain communities, that we were actually working with the communities who lived closest to the threat and who were most directly affected by the threat. So we have, I wouldn't say rebranded, but we've certainly profiled ourselves in our programming and our fundraising and our thinking around climate change. Because, for instance, what you just mentioned, the longer term time horizon, is directly linked to climate change. You can no longer assume that the risk today is the risk 10 or 20 years from now. So for us, it's been very liberating in the sense that it became clearer what pulled our mandate together. And we worked with the other agencies to measure the greenhouse gas emissions of the network. That's now routinely done. That led to setting the net zero carbon goal for 2030, which is very ambitious. I'm talking the entire network, not just the social side. And we're making progress on it. And we're now working on a range of other initiatives. One that is particularly, I think, ambitious and good is green buildings. Buildings are, not many people know, the largest source of carbon in the world is not just air conditioners, it's actually concrete, which is I would say almost an evil substance. So thinking about how you can build and do that in a way that requires less carbon is extremely important. It's actually highly possible. And it also goes very well with the network's history of an innovator in construction. So I'm really very excited about it, because obviously His Highness won't let us build green and ugly. So we actually have to think about how we build green and beautiful, and with all the architectural elements that are the hallmark of the network. To me, that's like the classic example of a fascinating challenge, and we're making progress.
Used alertly and intelligently, new technologies can help us cope with bewildering environmental challenges.
What is AKA doing in terms of seeking out these new technologies? Is there anything you can share in that environment?
Well, this is, to me, at the heart of the identity of AKA, because AKA is a combination of two things that His Highness always has pushed on. One is community engagement, having the community and local knowledge and mobilization of the community, volunteerism lead the way, which of course is at the heart of the magic of AKRSP's programming for many decades. And Focus has that same tradition. And the other is to use science. And I think everybody knows His Highness loves science, particularly certain forms of science, and he's really excited about it. And it's very inspiring. That's why he created DRMI, and then that got merged in AKA. And his logic, and he talked about this in that 16th interview that I talked about, because I was going to be based in Switzerland, and we talked about mountains, and it's very difficult to talk about mountains and not mention Switzerland. So he mentioned that it was frustrating to him that mountain communities were seen as marginal, when in Europe clearly Switzerland is the richest country and nobody would see it as marginal. And there's a interesting history behind how Switzerland got there, because it's not where Switzerland started. It was also marginal. And the mountains were seen as dangerous. The people were like backward farmers, and look at where we are today. And it hinges on several things, but two things we all know, actually three things. Switzerland invented tourism. Switzerland decided to spend the winter making watches, and Switzerland invented a type of banking that was very attractive. Three major innovations in a little country that supported this. Now, the question is, how do you build in those mountains? And the first realization is that what the Swiss did is they worked for 100, 150 years to tame their mountains, to secure their infrastructure, to make sure they were no longer a threat. And when you drive through Switzerland, either you go by train or by car, you can see it. When you go skiing, an avalanche is no risk to you, because they spot the avalanche before it comes, and then they dynamite it so that it doesn't fall on your head. And they got the famous Swiss helicopter rescues. Mm-hmm. So His Highness is like, why not in Hunza? Yeah. And there's an answer to that. There's several answers to that. But in the long term, the only question can be, yes, of course, also in Hunza. And then the question is, how do you get there? So his challenge is use technology, right? And then the other challenge is figure out a way that you can do it, that it's viable in the environment, because the culture is different, everything is different, and also affordable. Now then it becomes a little bit less easy than you just do the same thing as in Switzerland. You need to think through, and Switzerland is the example, there's other countries, right? You need to think through what is good about Switzerland and how you can use that in a certainly more cost-effective way, because otherwise, 150 years won't even be enough, because it's quite a costly thing, and the Himalayas are way bigger and more violent than the Alps. So it's a big challenge. So we do a lot of that. We work with MIT and Harvard. We work with NASA. We work with the California Institute of Emergency Management. We work with the government of British Columbia. We work with Karakoram University, UCA, AKU, SAIS in Johns Hopkins University. We work with several Swiss institutions as well as Italian ones on things like avalanche mitigation. Mm-hmm. We do as much as we can to learn. And our proposition is that this challenge of learning how you tame mountains and allow people to continue living there is very important, because as a world we can't afford everybody who lives in a mountainous area just to move to the plains. The plains are already full. Mm-hmm. You're talking 250 million people in the world today whose habitat is under active threat. It'll be 500 million before you know it. Where are we going to put them? It's going to lead to war. It's not possible. So we need to work to secure these habitats. And therefore, the challenge of learning is not just ours, but what His Highness told me is he wants the AKDN to be one of the leading voices of advocacy and also learning. Now, what we have, NASA, SAIS, Harvard, MIT, California, British Columbia, don't have, which is we don't just have the ability to work on the challenge, we have the link with the people who live there. And we have the access to go there. And most of our staff are local, the vast majority. So we can work with these institutions and have a routing in the community, volunteers in the community who work weather monitoring on a daily basis that doesn't otherwise exist. Basically a gigantic field lab for innovation. So it's actually quite easy for us to get researchers interested and that way advance our own learning and with that advance science, because the AKDN doesn't learn for itself, it learns to share with others. And we're investing in that a lot. That's obviously all long term, but we've already learned a lot. And I think the focus on learning has strengthened under the AKA banner because His Highness pushed on that. So we put some specific resources on that at head office level and in the countries. And you know, it's Googleable, the publications, the awards that are there around AKA's innovation. One thing I want to mention is COP26, the climate change conference. We went there, I was invited because AKA Pakistan won the Gold Award in the World Habitat Awards in 2020 for its innovation in combining risk mapping with community, with science. And I went there hoping to find other people who were trying to do the same thing so that we could all learn. And what I found is there were many people very interested in what we did. But they all wanted to learn from us because nobody else had that very ambitious combination all the way from community mobilization to the kind of science, GIS database, weather mapping, modeling and everything, that it is world class. I can say that because I'm no technical expert, so I'm not giving myself a compliment, I'm only giving my team a compliment. But they're really fantastic. So the message was, we want to learn from you because you're like at the cutting edge. On the one hand I was proud, on the other hand I was a little disappointed because I would have loved to find an AKA in the Andes to learn from. But you know, we can still work with the people in the Andes so that they can also learn. But it was a discovery for me actually.
What is AKA doing around gender equity, inclusion of women?
Well, the first and most important thing that I want to speak about, because we're very proud of it, is our volunteers. And this is a focused tradition, but they're now working in the AKA programs. We have 40,000 volunteers in the countries in which we work. Over 40% of them are women, and of the latest recruits, it's 50% because we made that an explicit goal. Why were women always there? Well, partly because the Ismaili community, of course, is different than other communities, but significantly because if you don't have women volunteers, you can't do your work. Because these volunteers are the ones who knock on the door in the middle of the night and say it's time to evacuate. In the countries that I'm talking about, a man cannot knock on the door in the middle of the night because they will not open the door and listen. It's not acceptable. You have to have women. It's a tremendous source of empowerment at the community level. All volunteers are very proud, but many of the women volunteers in particular have gone on to be community leaders, and I think that's a very powerful mechanism. Or simply pushed harder in school and made it to AKU or wherever they wanted to go. So it's been a good thing. Now, in our programming, AKRSP, of course, has a fantastic tradition. When we think of emergency management, recently we've thought much more about the fact that those who are affected by natural disaster, that women and children are particularly vulnerable, and you need to work much more targeted to safeguard them. So we're doing a lot of work right now. Then there's the organization itself. So I'm very proud to say my senior leadership team is 50% women and has been for many years, and I will not have it any other way. So it's sometimes difficult because I do believe in meritocracy, like His Highness wants us to. But I also believe that you have a fundamentally different agency if you've got 50% women in your leadership. So you have to find a way to achieve that. we've achieved that without compromising on quality, and I'm very proud of that.
How does AKA decide which disasters to respond to? Thinking about the sort of, I guess, the frequency, the nature, the type of human and physical disasters that we face?
That's a very straightforward system. We have what we call AKA program areas. We respond to any natural disaster, and our CEOs, the AKA CEOs in country, are authorized and instructed to respond without calling Geneva, because typically these disasters strike in the middle of the night in Europe, and it's just a waste of time to call me and say, can we respond? We don't do that. We have standard operating protocols. That's for natural disasters. And it doesn't matter what the nature of the natural disaster is, because we aim to respond to all of them. We can't, of course, predict all of them, because, for instance, earthquakes are essentially impossible to predict, other than that it comes in a certain location, but you can't predict when it comes. So, but for others, we try to do that. The non-core areas, we respond to our capability if the government requests us to do so, because obviously it is important, and it's a long-standing vision of His Highness, that we don't only take care of our own. So if the government says, we had an issue of floods in Kerala, and the government of India said, we know your disaster assessment teams are really good, can you send some there to do assessments? We do that. But we don't do it indiscriminately, because obviously our resources are limited, particularly in a country like India. We couldn't do everything, and the government actually doesn't ask us that.
Thank you, Onno, for sharing that, and also for your insights into the work of AKA and how it's developed, established, evolved over the last 6-7 years now. So yeah, thank you for your time and for the conversation.
You're welcome. It's been very nice talking. Thank you.